For over 33 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we want to examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. And we begin with images from the western Russian region of Rostov-on-Don. In that particular area, the Ukrainian army launched massive and intense attacks both yesterday and throughout last night. On one hand, using Storm Shadow cruise missiles provided by the United Kingdom, and on the other hand, most likely using drones. We're taking a look at the recordings from yesterday, which were captured in the city of Kamensk-Shakhtinsky. And here we first see very shaky footage, which nonetheless clearly shows us that this is a Storm Shadow cruise missile. Several of them flew towards this military city, and here we can see the impacts now. Once again, the interesting part is we see significant efforts by the Russian army using anti-aircraft defenses to intercept the respective cruise missiles. It is often claimed that these relatively old, up to 20-year-old cruise missiles, which are primarily guided by GPS, can be intercepted quite effectively and with significant success. Yet the reality is different. Up here, these stripes show that Russian units here are equipped with S-300, S-400, and fire as much as they can into the air. However, if we simply look at the footage down here, we can see that the first two impacts are already here. There's the first cloud and there's the second one, which pinpoints the whole situation. It's essentially a facility producing rocket fuel located in the town called Kamensk-Shakhtinsky. And we will soon see this, as the cameraman still attempts to get a clear view of the situation. Another explosion occurs at exactly the same location, directly behind the factory's entrance walls. It's a dramatic moment that highlights the volatility of what's unfolding before us. That means, despite all these efforts by the Russians to intercept these missiles, I'm just letting it run now. They end in no success whatsoever, instead resulting in us observing at least 3 Storm Shadow impacts within this missile fuel factory. And that was just the first attack on Rostov, which happened yesterday early evening, and it continued last night in the city of Novochakhtinsk. And also, as mentioned, Novochakhtinsk is beyond the border, beyond the Luhansk region in Rostov, and there it hit an oil refinery that has been blazing since last night. This means once again we see the Ukrainians trying strategically to attack behind the front in Western Russia in order to weaken the Russian capabilities to continue this war. We'll take a look at this on the map and see once again that for these attacks you also need long-range weapons. That doesn't work with short-range artillery or rockets, but rather you need more sophisticated weaponry, like the kind that has been delivered by the Western allies such as Storm Shadow and other advanced systems. We can clearly observe that Kamensk-Shakhtinsky, the area where the rocket factory faced an attack yesterday, and Novochakhtinsk, where the refinery was seen burning, have been both severely impacted by these ongoing events. And when we take a closer look at the distance up there on the map, we can quite clearly see that it's almost around 200 kilometers or nearly that distance all the way up to the front line. Not just up to the front, but a few kilometers behind the front as well, from where you can relatively safely deploy these cruise missiles. It is likely that, as observed in the past, the Ukrainians utilize fighter jets of the type Su-24 or possibly even F-16 by now, it's not clear, equipped with these. Storm Shadow or Scalp EG, that's the French alternative cruise missile, relatively close to the front lines, as close as they can get while remaining safe, and then they let these cruise missiles rain down on the targeted cities, either in the occupied area of eastern Ukraine or, as in this situation, in the western parts of Russia. We're coming from Russia into Ukraine, wanting to take a closer look at the Kurakhove region, and right here we have numerous new recordings that clearly show us the ongoing Russian advances continuing, that Ukraine is putting enormous efforts into defending this area. And we begin with the footage of a Russian advance, specifically here it's once again 4 armored vehicles, a main battle tank leading the way, followed by 3 other armored vehicles. The Ukrainians are strategically employing these vehicles for their defense. A frequently observed strategy involving FPV drone attacks specifically aimed at halting the progress of these armored vehicles. We observe that the footage is quite shaky as it has been captured from a fairly considerable distance away. Nonetheless, we can already see that once again armored personnel carriers and tanks are being deployed, and we see once again that the Ukrainian army is countering with FPV drones, resulting in direct hits time and again. I think here you can see it quite well. Here you see that's the first vehicle, that's the tank, which is also firing in that direction. 3 more vehicles following and then trying accordingly. I think the shot has to be fired any moment now. Trying accordingly, there we see it, to move the infantry into the respective positions. And once again, we see significant losses here. 3 to 4 of the 4 vehicles are taken out by the Ukrainians. We see how one of them doesn't make it through this forest battle anymore. We see it here, but it's already burning, and the others just on the left side of it where they just drove on. Then they are brought to a stop. At least 2 of them come to a halt. Well, it's possible another one might have made it through. And of course, it's not merely Ukrainian efforts at drone defense we're observing, but we're also seeing that the Russians are launching attacks with kamikaze drones in this area. And these are relatively new findings, also with drones controlled by fiber optics. And you can already see from the nature these shots are not brand new, but at least 2 to 3 weeks old before the snow fell in the fall. However, it was not known until now that the Russian army also uses these fiber optic guided drones in the east of Ukraine. There was very little evidence of that initially. I don't recall anything from the Kurakhove area. However, in Kursk they are actively being used, and now we can observe here how a Ukrainian vehicle, specifically an M113 personnel carrier, is still moving and now attempting to take cover within this small forested area. However, the Russian drone, we see it here with the RPG-7 warhead, even though it's hanging from a fiber optic cable, so even though it only operates within a specific range because it's controlled through a fiber optic cable, yet it still successfully manages to realign itself and adopt a new attack angle on the targeted vehicle. We see it now here, first getting an overview of the pilot, and then looks from behind where the M113 vehicle just traveled, and then flies directly into this vehicle from behind. And that is, of course, relatively, at least from a military perspective, relatively impressive, because these drones, these fiber optic controlled drones haven't been used for a long time, as the question, which Ukrainians also often mention, they are rather pricey, and it's not entirely clear how good the cable holds, and if it tangles in a tree or on a post, you simply can't move on. Nonetheless, the Russians continue to rely on this technology, sticking to the idea that you have to get closer, a maximum of 8 kilometers, not 15 to 20 like with FPV drones. In urban terrain, options are quite limited and challenging. Nonetheless, despite these hurdles, some Russian drone pilots have remarkably managed to specialize very successfully in employing this specific tactic. That it successfully manages to track Ukrainian vehicles even through dense forests and then target them with great precision. We are still staying in Kurakhove. We have new footage here that finally shows us that the location of Uspenivka, a place at a very important crossroads south of Kurakhove, that it has now been captured by the Russian army. We observe Russian soldiers walking along the streets, and this naturally also suggests that there is no longer a great fear of Ukrainian drones, which theoretically can still strike. But we see the direct combat movements with Ukrainian soldiers very close by, and with drones constantly raining down on the Russians. They seem to be over here in Uspenivka, and accordingly the Russians are celebrating another victory over a completely destroyed place, as we can see here. It is situated at a crucial and strategically important intersection, specifically between Kurakhove, which is for the most part now under Russian control, just like Wuhledar, a city somewhat further to the south where the Ukrainian forces also strategically withdrew from approximately 2 months ago. Let's take another look at the situation and also see where Uspenivka is. And see that on our map from the provider Deep State Map, this area here is still quite small, so the orange is, as mentioned, an area where there is still combat. That means there are still some fighters here, but we see that's most of Uspenivka. And here again, it's very important to see the roads. So we see here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 roads all converging in Uspenivka. All these roads are currently under Russian control. There are practically no options available for the Ukrainians to come back here, or at the moment at least not to return anytime soon, order to effectively supply troops stationed there. In this context, the Ukrainians have chosen to retreat. Kurakhove is also predominantly under Russian control. Furthermore, we see that the Ukrainian army is actively working to establish a new defensive line by moving forward from Dakhny on one side and then through a significantly greater effort from Andrivka on the other side. However, this entire vast area, we'd seen this battle going on for months, not just Kurakhove, but also as many as 10 smaller settlements that are located to the south of it have now been brought under Russian control. This demonstrates that the massive offensive launched by the Russian army eventually and successfully led to them capturing and establishing control over this area over time. We move a bit further north to Chasiv Yar, where we have new footage available, which indicates that the Ukrainian army, unlike in some other cities, persistently continues to fight for control, continues to fight for every square meter in Chasiv Yar. On the other hand, we also see a not really new but somewhat efficient type of larger kamikaze drones. Russia also has at its disposal and can use against buildings that are currently under the control of Ukrainian soldiers. Let's take an in-depth look at the footage, and here we can clearly see a drone making its approach that initially looks similar to what we just saw. However, it is a larger, more powerful drone that likely doesn't have 4 propellers, but instead has only 1 propeller and fixed wings, a kind of small airplane. We now see the drone's approach first from its perspective, and then shortly from another surveillance drone's viewpoint. What's being attacked here, and you can already see the destruction. We'll see it more clearly in a moment. And you can see here in the top left, You need to focus on it, so here in the top left, the drone is about to appear soon. You can see them again clearly here in the video. Those are the wings, that's how the attack unfolds, and I believe that this particular house here is being targeted for the attack. The explosion that's about to occur really reveals that it isn't just a small drone, but rather holds a considerable amount of explosives within, which ultimately leads to us having a relatively devastating explosion in this house. I'll run it again to gain better clarity on the whole situation. Then, we can carefully examine the neighboring houses and clearly see that nearly every one of them had lost their roofs completely. We see the complete destruction in Chasiv Yar, but we see it's different than in Kurakhove, for example, where we saw that the town hall was captured, which still had an intact roof. Houses nearby were only slightly damaged. In Chasiv Yar, it's very different. This city was quite clearly declared to be a strategically significant city, and therefore a crucial fortress that needs defending by the Ukrainian generals. And accordingly, we see that there's much tougher fighting here, the fighting lasts much longer, and that there's also no willingness to leave this city without a fight. But here, there's fierce fighting for every single square meter. Let's take a quick look at the map once more to see again what the Russian army has managed to achieve since May of the year 2023. So that's been quite some time ago. Now let's see here. We have Bakhmut, this major city with, I believe, 75,000 inhabitants right here. And if we take a look up there, it's almost 3 kilometers or so in length. Therefore, the Russian army is roughly, what would you say, in distance to Chasiv Yar. Not even 20 kilometers, probably only 15 kilometers advanced. That's a relatively short distance compared to many other front sections, where dozens of kilometers have been moved forward. For instance, from Avdiivka, and the footage we just viewed originates from an area slightly south of the city center. There, the Ukrainian army holds on despite massive Russian bombardments, despite the destruction of the entire residential infrastructure there. They continue to hold the ruins and try at all costs to prevent any advance and complete capture of Chasiv Yar by the Russian army. We have new footage from the Ukrainian Air Force, which is daily working to combat Russian drone attacks with Geran 1 and Geran 2, formerly Shahid 136 and Shahid 131 drones, to deter from Ukraine, which is trying to locate these drones on radar systems and with all possible weapon systems, whether they are ground-based missile systems, anti-aircraft tanks of the Gepard type, or their own aircraft. They are making a concerted effort to prevent these vehicles from successfully reaching their intended final positions. And in this impressive footage, we once again observe a Ukrainian Air Force Mi-8 helicopter prominently displayed, while here we see a Russian Geran 2 unmanned drone measuring nearly 4 meters in length, which contains several dozen kilograms of explosive material aboard, and would indeed lead to immense and massive destruction if it succeeded in reaching a strategic target. We see the Mi-8 following this drone, flying after it, and simultaneously shooting from it. That means soldiers are shooting at the drone up front with machine guns. Now we can take another look at the last moment. Here is the drone, here the helicopter, that's maybe 100 meters between the two. And now we can see that the drone got hit. It is now gradually falling to the ground, crashing down here because its engine got struck. And we can also see the explosions on the ground are quite large, fortunately just on a snowy field. There we see it happening. Fortunately, it's not at any military site or critical infrastructure facility. In this regard, we see it. The Ukrainian Air Force is making great efforts to fend off up to 100 Russian kamikaze drones that are shot at Ukraine each day, thus trying to protect its infrastructure. Ultimately, we plan to examine 2 significant efforts focused on preparing for war and engaging in thorough training. Let's first take a look from the Ukrainian side and then from the Russian side. I mentioned earlier that the Ukraine is making an effort to employ a variety of methods to intercept and shoot down Russian drones and cruise missiles. And here we see one of the training sessions for it. What we have here is, in the city of Sumy, we are allowed to reveal a M2 Browning machine gun simulator. So in this particular setup, we are witnessing a Ukrainian soldier who is equipped with a virtual reality headset and is actively participating in operating a training simulator that's supposed to simulate this M2 Browning on a pickup or something similar. What we don't see now, and that was probably broken that day, is the recoil simulator. Ideally, it should be moving back and forth during firing to accurately simulate the recoil effect, clearly demonstrating that you need to realign yourself after every successful shot. Nonetheless, it's relatively easy to observe. That's how they train, primarily to effectively shoot down enemy drones. And then, kindly enough, Maria Avdiivka, who took these shots, put herself up to one of these simulators and has just worn this VR headset themselves. Now you see what it looks like. From the perspective of the trainee who is trying to orient themselves right now, and on one side here recognizes how many rounds he currently still has at his disposal, while on the other side he visibly observes the horizon directly ahead of him and accordingly makes the effort to shoot down any approaching drones flying at him. And the entire thing. At first, it looks like a computer game, quite amusing, but it is deadly serious, as we've seen repeatedly in recent weeks. Like these M2 Browning machine guns mounted on small Toyota or Ford or whatever off-road vehicles were used to actually defend themselves, to actually shoot down these drones and thus prevent a catastrophe in the respective regions where these drones were actually supposed to hit. So much for Ukrainian training measures for the war, and in the end, a few images that, yes, I find relatively surreal, but also show how helpless one currently is against FPV drones. And these images come from the Russian army. Here they apparently conducted, well, what can we call it, a fall to the ground and shoot the FPV kamikaze drones training session. These is actual and genuine recorded footage from a Russian military base. You can now observe that these instructors are indeed throwing the drone, so to speak, with a grenade attached towards the soldiers. And they have to lie down and attempt to dodge it. Let's take a brief closer look at it for a moment. So here first is what we're looking at above. That's the small quadcopter priced at about 500 euros, and below it is the large grenade that's attached there. In this case, a practice grenade. We see the soldier needs to prepare on one side, lie down, but now also, and this is quite interesting, the Russians have apparently said the soldiers should try to shoot down these drones. That means we always see it the same way, that you shouldn't just throw yourself down, but that you should also try to take out the drone afterwards. And from personal experience, I once participated in such an exercise myself. It's almost impossible. Therefore, it's genuinely almost impossible to hit a fast-moving kamikaze drone, such as a small quadcopter using a regular rifle. It's so quick in any direction, you can't really gauge it any other way than with this cord here. It can soar in any direction, can achieve any speed, and in that respect, indeed, interesting footage, but it mainly shows the helplessness. Especially with such assault rifles, it's almost impossible to shoot down such drones. The situation is different when it comes to shotguns, specifically with shotgun shells. There are more and more units out in combat equipped with shotguns. That means that this buckshot round, which disperses into many, many tiny projectiles and then moves across a relatively large area towards the drone, indeed does have a significant chance with one or two tiny pellets successfully hitting the drone. But what we see in the footage is contrary to that. The ordinary rifle ammunition puts the soldiers in a quite hopeless situation against a drone. Even so, it's clear that the Russians are actively preparing for possible kamikaze drone attacks, desperately trying various methods in an attempt to bring them down.